In this video, we'll be discussing potentiality and actuality in Aristotle's Metaphysics book, Theta. In Theta 1, Aristotle first introduces a new term for us that essentially refers to actuality, but it's got slightly different connotations. That's entelechy, which is an anglicization of Aristotle's own neologism in the Greek, which is a combination of en, or within, telos, which is the completion or the end, and the verb ekein, which is to be in a certain state. So that's where this entelechy comes from, en, within, telos, and ekein, to be in a certain state of completion. So the idea of this word is something like the state of being completed or perfected or realized. In the history of philosophy, this term, entelechy, would become associated with the vital principle or the soul of a substance, the unifying point that gives it its vitality and its energy. So Aristotle says he's going to look in this chapter at potentiality and entelechy. He says that he wants to go beyond the account of potentiality and actuality in terms of process, for example, the development of a caterpillar into a butterfly. And this is because, he says, for it is not the case that potentiality and actuality are confined to those cases, the account of which is in terms of process. Actuality and potentiality, even though we most naturally learn the meaning of these terms in relationship to some process that's occurring, like a caterpillar's actualizing its potential to become a butterfly, this isn't the only case. It is the primary case. The primary case of potentiality and actuality are going to be is going to be found in the developmental process, but it's not the only case. So this chapter introduces an important distinction between active and passive potentiality. Active and passive potentiality. So if you look on 254, central paragraph here in our text, this is 1046a. He says, there are kinds of potentiality that are related to the same form, and these are all kinds of principle. There are counts relating to a single potentiality, which is the principle of change, either A, for something else, or B, for the thing that it is in, qua something else. There is, for example, the potentiality for being affected, which is a principle in the subject of change itself, of being changed by the action either of something else or by itself qua something else. And in contrast, there's a condition of immunity to deterioration and destruction at the hands of an external agent or of the bearer of the condition itself qua something else through a principle of change. And in defining any potentiality of these kinds, we must bring in the account of primary potentiality. In other words, there is a potentiality of a substance to affect another substance or itself. And in this respect, he says we're acting. If I'm acting on myself, I'm acting on myself qua another substance, as it were. I'm divided into two: the agent self and then the patient self, or the self that's being acted on. So there's part of me that's doing the acting, part that's being acted on. So I'm divided in that way. But it's the easier case is just to think of one substance acting on another substance. But we should keep in mind that it is possible to exhibit active and passive potentiality within a single substance that is acting upon itself. As in when I scratch my forehead or something like that. So there's a potentiality of a substance to affect another substance through its action. And if this is the case, if there is a potentiality that is active, then there will also have to be at the same time a corresponding passive potentiality. So we can think of this as the active and passive potentialities of, for example, the rock, paper, scissors game, right? You know, rock, paper, scissors. Well, that's paper, rock, scissors, paper. I don't know. Obviously, it's been a while since I played this game. But each of these three possibilities, rock, paper, and scissors, there we got it, has one active and one passive potentiality. So, you know, the scissors has the active potentiality to cut the paper, but it also has the passive potentiality to be crushed by the rock, and so on with the other two cases. And so in both cases, these are potentialities in the thing, in the scissors. Aristotle next makes the point that in any given case, these two sorts of potentiality, active and passive, are not really two distinct things, but they're really one thing. It's a complex. There's a kind of, we might think of it as a relational potentiality that has one pole, which is the agent or the active part, and then another pole, which is the patient or the passive part. So he describes this in 254, continuing on to 255, 1046a, where he says, another way of looking at it is that the account of potentialities of this stripe is in terms either of their having or undergoing an effect, or of their doing either of these well. But this means that in accounts of the latter kind, those of the former kinds of potentiality are somehow present. And so when you're dealing with an active and a passive potentiality, there's a kind of implicit inclusion of the other half of the relation when you're talking about a passive potentiality. To talk about the cutting potential of scissors presupposes that there's something out there, paper or whatever it may be, that has the potentiality to be cut. Okay? So there's this relationship between these kinds of potentialities when we are talking about active, passive potentiality complexes. Every active potentiality relates or correlates to a corresponding passive potentiality in another substance. It depends on the other substance having that potentiality in order to be itself an active potentiality. Hence, these two potentialities are really just one relation. He continues, an uncontentious point is that there is a way in which the potentiality for action and affection are a single potentiality. Something's potentiality may consist in its own capacity to be acted on, and in something else's having the capacity to be acted on by it. And B, a way in which they are different. They are different as follows. 1, the one potentiality resides in the thing affected, for it is affected through containing a certain principle, and through its matters containing a certain principle, such that different things are affected by different agents. For instance, an oily thing is inflammable, and a thing with such and such a proclivity to subside is compressible, and so on. It says inflammable in the text, but I think that must mean, he must have intended to say flammable there. 2, the other potentiality is in the agent. Examples are warmth and architecture. The one in the calorific agent, the other in the builder. Okay, so you get the general idea here. Every potentiality that is active relates or correlates to a potentiality that's passive in either itself or some other thing, and vice versa. Aristotle goes on to say, in the conclusion of this chapter, that corresponding to this type of relational active passive potentiality, there is the possibility of a privation or a non-potentiality, and this he calls incapacity. So an incapacity is going to go along with this kind of active-passive potentiality relationship. incapacity, as he understands it, depends upon a norm. So blindness would not be an incapacity in a tree, for example, because normally trees don't have sight. But blindness would be an incapacity in, say, a cat, because cats normally do have sight. So it's only in an organism of a type that's normally capable of vision that it's possible to have an incapacity. There's this background sense of the norm or the normal state of affairs that is required in order for us to speak of the incapacity of a thing. So it's a privation of potentiality in a certain way that a thing normally has, a privation of its normal powers. That's how Aristotle understands the nature of incapacity. It's not a potentiality, but it's a kind of or an actuality, but it's a kind of a privation of both in relationship to some background norm. Okay, so that's active and passive potentiality. In Theta 2, turning to chapter 2 now, the key distinction here is between a potentiality with reason and a potentiality without reason. So now we're dealing with irrational and rational potentialities. Irrational and rational potentialities. Irrational personalities are the more general type. These correspond to the fixed, regular production of a single type of outcome. As Aristotle writes, heat is potentially only for warming. So that would be an example of an irrational potentiality. This fixed, regular production of a single outcome. Whereas rational potentialities, by contrast, occur only in animate beings and above all in men. The distinguishing feature of rational potentialities is that of two opposing possible outcomes, there is a potential to produce either one. Or, as Aristotle explains, medicine is a potentiality for both sickness and health. The explanation of the difference is that the rational potentiality rests on what he here calls an account. So this kind rests on an account. A rational personality rests on an account, which is a rational understanding of the subject, an understanding of the sphere in which the potentiality is to be actualized. And he says the same account elucidates both the object and the privation of it. That is, to understand how to produce health is at the same time an understanding of how to produce sickness. So the characteristic of this rational form of potentiality is that, unlike the irrational form, where you just have one circuit, so to speak, where heat only is able to produce warmth, that wasn't potentially only for warming, not warmth. Heat and warmth seem like they're degrees of the same thing. Heat is for producing warmth. That's the only thing that it produces, warmth in a body, for example. Whereas in the case of the rational, there's always going to be the possibility of having one outcome or also producing its opposite. It's the doctor who has the greatest potentiality to produce illness because of the rational understanding of the subject of medicine that the doctor has. The doctor is able to produce health, but also at the same time is able to produce sickness. So while the irrational potentiality is only capable of producing one of two sets of opposites, heat can only produce warming, it can't produce cooling. A rational potentiality is capable of a kind of decision. Between two opposite outcomes. However, this does not imply that the triggering of a rational potentiality is somehow random or arbitrary. That would destroy it as a true potentiality. there has to be some degree of predictability and regularity. So as Aristotle explains in chapter 5 on 264, just for the time being skipping ahead here, he says, this is 1048a, but beginning right in the middle of the page, 264. He says, the arrangement is that selection of the two possible contrary effects is under the control of desire and takes place when the context is propitious to the potentiality and the agent is associated with the item affected by the potentiality. And a necessary consequence of this is that whenever a rational bearer of potentiality is, in propitious circumstances, moved by desire for the object of the potentiality, it acts on it. So it seems like we're here in the realm of character. What Aristotle wants to say is that the rational potentiality of a person is correlated with a certain, as it were, standard operating procedure leading to a kind of regular outcome, because there's a kind of rational disposition to make certain types of choices and certain types of desires and preferences, which the person is going to tend to inculcate. So to go back to the example of the doctor, we expect a doctor to have been trained and socialized to use their medical powers for good, for producing health, not for producing sickness. Something went wrong in the development of the character of the doctor if they go around making people sick intentionally. So even though there's choice involved, that doesn't mean it's random or arbitrary. That's the point he's making. Okay. So, on to Theta 3. The aim of this chapter is to target the philosophers of the Megarian school. Megara. You can Google them if you want to know more about them. I'm not going to worry about that here. Megarian school, who challenged the notion of potentiality. These guys challenge the very notion. So keep in mind that Aristotle is introducing this idea of potentiality as a kind of midway point between being or non-being. All kinds of problems arose in previous philosophers because of this assumption that it was a binary choice between non-being and being. And Aristotle said, no, that's not the case. There's an intermediary between the two, and that is potentiality. Potentiality, which is in one way non-being because it's not actual, but in another way it is a being because it is a real power in a thing to actualize itself in a certain way. So the question that the Megarian school is asking is, why should we suppose that there's such a thing as real potentiality at all? Why should we suppose there's such a thing as this at all? And the argument, the basic idea behind the anti-Megarian, or rather the anti-potential position of the Megarian school, we might call Megarian anti-potentialism, it can be stated like this. So the idea is that all that is real is actual. Second, potentiality isn't actual. Therefore, potentiality isn't real or doesn't exist, right? So it's just that line of thinking. All that is real is actual. Potentiality isn't actual. Therefore, potentiality isn't real. Potentiality doesn't exist. So, in modern philosophy, just to briefly footnote this for a point that we'll pick up later on in the next series of videos at some point. The general strategy against the notion of potentiality will be reductionistic. We talked about reductionism in the previous video. It will be reductionistic. The modern critics of the idea of potentiality, real potentiality, will say that the notion of potentiality can be completely reduced to concepts of its actual present properties. And whether this is possible or not is still a subject of dispute in contemporary metaphysics. So we'll be returning to this in our next series on scholasticism. Now, the position that Aristotle assigns to Megara is somewhat more specific. He says, this is 258, 1046b, he says that X is capable of doing the F only when it actually does the F. So X and F obviously being variables here for any substance and any action. The claim being that it's only capable when it is actually doing it. The problem with this is that it implies, as Aristotle notes, that when a man is not engaged in building a building, then he is not even a builder. And that sounds absurd. You know, it's as if you met someone at a party and you ask them, hey, what do you do for a living? And they say, I'm a builder. And you say, liar, liar. You're not building anything now. You're sitting here, sipping on a martini or whatever. How dare you lie to me and say you're a builder? That would be ridiculous. Being a builder means having a skill, not wielding it at every moment. And Aristotle says, otherwise, the moment a man lays down his trowel, he will no longer have the skill. So the builder example is one of the rational potentialities that Aristotle can account for in terms of this theory that we just covered of the irrational and rational potentialities. But Aristotle points out that this Megarian position, denying potentiality, is equally problematic in the case of the irrational potentialities. This leads, he thinks, to a radical Protagorean, that is characteristic of the sophist Protagoras, a radical Protagorean subjectivistic idealism, where there will be nothing cold or hot or pleasant or perceptible at all unless someone is currently observing it. Moreover, blindness and deafness cannot be distinguished from sleep. So Aristotle adds to this the following argument, and this is a little bit longer, so I'm just going to say it slowly. It's pretty clear and straightforward. Premise 1. Anything deprived of its potentiality lacks capacity. Anything deprived of its potentiality lacks capacity. Premise 2. Therefore, if there is no potentiality, there is no capacity. Therefore, if there is no potentiality, there is no capacity. 3. If there is no capacity, there is no capacity to happen. If there is no capacity, there is no capacity to happen. Therefore, if there is no capacity to happen, nothing that is not already happening can happen. Therefore, if there's no capacity to happen, nothing that is not already happening can happen. That's premise 4. Premise 5 is, thus, if there is no potentiality, nothing that is not already happening, that is, in the present moment, can ever happen. If there is no potentiality, nothing that is not already happening can ever happen. But this is absurd. It does away with all process and generation. And that's the conclusion of the reductio ad absurdum. This would do away with all process and generation. So you see this Aristotle allow himself a rare bit of humor or satire or snark, I guess we would say. He says, so our brilliant, this is close to the middle of page 259, 1047a. He says, and so our brilliant Megarian friends will now have done away with all process and generation. The standing will remain on their feet, and the seated on those places where the Megarians keep their brains, that is, on their butts, to all eternity. Right? So this is an absurd position. And that really also articulates one of the main motivations, if not the main motivation, for Aristotle introducing this idea of potentiality. It is in order to be able to account for the very possibility of change, the very possibility of, in particular, processes, natural processes, artificial processes, and generation. Okay. So this leads to the first discussion question. Does Aristotle do an adequate job of refuting the notion that all that exists is actual, hence there is no real potentiality? Why suppose that there is such a thing as real potentiality at all? Once again, does Aristotle do an adequate job of refuting the notion that all that exists is actual, hence there is no real potentiality? Why suppose that there is such a thing as a real potentiality at all? Theta 4. Now Aristotle takes up the question, how far does his notion of potentiality go? Really? How far does his notion of potentiality go? What do I mean? Well, the Megarians went to one extreme in denying the very existence of potentiality. However, it seems that there is an opposite danger here. Might one assert the existence of real potentialities that are never actualized? Might one assert the existence of real potentialities that are never actualized? And if you think of that as a way of asserting that there are real things that are never realized, it can seem to be an equally absurd conclusion. Aristotle recognizes a potential problem here. If we allow unrestricted reality to any and all potentialities, even if they are not and never will be realized, then we lose an important category, namely the category of the impossible. That is, it becomes the case that nothing is ever impossible. Nothing is ever impossible. If everything is potential, nothing is ever impossible. So is Aristotle denying this category? Is he denying the impossible? So if we look at 262, I think I've got the wrong citation here. This is 261. Theta 4. To see what I mean, take a man who says that the diagonal of a square is capable of being measured but will not be measured. Such a person will lack a grasp of what it is to be incapable of being, on the grounds that there is nothing to prevent something that is incapable of being or becoming from not being or being about to be. It is, after all, a necessary conclusion of our premises that there is nothing impossible in what is said, given that we might suppose that what is not but is capable of being either is or comes into being. That's a complicated construction when you're talking about a lot of senses of being here. And yet what is said is impossible, for it is impossible that the diagonal can be measured. So, just to boil this down, what Aristotle is trying to say here in 261 is that clearly there are cases of the impossible, and we can just point to examples in geometry of things that are impossible. So we don't want to deny the category of the impossible. At the very least, you must allow for there to be mathematical and logical impossibilities. But that means that there are cases in which a certain potentiality doesn't exist. Now, this raises an interesting question. Okay, there are cases in which there is no potentiality. What is the relationship between impossibility and lack of potentiality in these cases? Which is primary? Is it impossible because there's never a realized potential in such cases? Or is there never a realized potential because it is impossible? It does seem that Aristotle owes us here a clearer account of possibility and necessity, and of course the corresponding ideas of impossibility. He seems to hold the view that the impossible is, by definition, that which is never realized. But it seems like that is not adequate. You might wonder, what about the road not taken? If a human potentiality is never realized, does that mean it was never a potentiality at all? It seems like there needs to be this category of things that are never realized but are actual potentialities. So that leads to a second discussion question. Let's explore this a little bit. Might one assert the existence of potentialities that are never realized? Does Aristotle have good arguments or reasons for denying such things? What implications, if any, does this have for moral responsibility and free will? So once again, second discussion question. Might one assert the existence of potentialities that are never realized? Does Aristotle have good arguments or reasons for denying such things? What implications, if any, does this have for moral responsibility and free will? Okay, Theta 5. This chapter introduces another distinction between types of potentialities, this time between natural and acquired potentialities. And there's going to be a kind of correspondence here with an earlier distinction, with the natural potentialities going with the irrational potentialities and the rational going with the acquired potentialities. So his position is that an irrational an irrational potentiality must in all cases be inborn, innate or naturally acquired. Whereas an irrational potentiality must be in all cases acquired by training or education. So Aristotle's example is a natural potentiality is the senses, active and passive, and an acquired potentiality would be flute playing, which must be acquired by training. The second major point that Aristotle makes in this chapter about potentialities is that every potentiality has a directedness towards a specific end. And not only a specific end, but a specific end at a definite time and in a characteristic manner. So on 263, right by 1048a there, it says, the bearer of a potentiality has a potentiality for x at time t and manner m. The bearer of potentiality has a potentiality for x at time t and manner m. Potentiality is always going to have an object or a goal that it is directed towards. The caterpillar wants to become a butterfly, as it were, but at a particular time and in a particular manner. Right? So it's only when the time is ripe, when it reaches a certain maturity, that the caterpillar becomes a butterfly, and it always does this through the same manner, weaving a cocoon for itself or whatever it might be. Okay. So that is Theta 5. In Theta 6, Aristotle turns from the topic of potentiality to that of actuality. And he poses two questions here. Quite clearly, they're clearly inset there on page 266. The first is, what is actuality? What sort of thing is actuality? And the second, that is the second. The first is, what is actuality? And the second is, what sort of thing is actuality? And we know that this is contrasted with potentiality, but besides that, what is it? What is it, as it were, in itself? That's the question. So what is actuality, and what sort of thing is actuality? Really, I guess, understandably, it's easy to just slide from one to the other because they seem to be very close. That was not my excuse ever. My excuse is that my cat is distracting me once again, but at least that's the immediate reason. The ultimate reason is COVID, I guess. Okay, so what is actuality? That's the question. Aristotle's answer is that the actuality of an object is its obtaining. It's obtaining. When something obtains. Does the situation obtain? If it obtains, we're talking or referring to its actuality for Aristotle. He says that the way to clarify what he means is by examining individual cases of such obtaining. So on 267, where it's 1048b, he says, the point is that there is an analogous relation between the following pairs of items. The engaged builder slash the apt to build. So that's the first pair, the engaged builder and the apt to build. Second one is the waking slash the sleeping. Next one is the engaged observer slash the sighted animal with eyes closed. Next is the thing carved from matter slash the matter with the processed. The thing carved with the matter slash the matter, and the process, the unprocessed. He says, then we simply require that the former element of these pairs be the actuality by definition, and the latter by potentiality. So Aristotle is suggesting here that there's no generic abstract account of what this obtaining is in which the actuality consists, but provided that you can see the analogy between the first items in these coupled pairs, you get the idea that the engaged builder is analogous to waking, is analogous to the engaged observer, is analogous to the processed. And so there's, you get the drift, get the picture. That's what obtaining means. Note how this links actuality with process. And both notions are linked with the need for a temporal unfolding. So being is linked to time insofar as it is actuality. That seems to be what Aristotle is saying here. Being is linked to time. It's as if he's saying being is, or actuality at least, being in the sense of actuality is being having become over time so that it obtains. Okay, that's actuality. Next, Aristotle turns to the concept of infinity, which leads him to distinguish two types of action. The distinguishing feature of infinity for Aristotle is that it does not fit into the scheme of actuality and potentiality. Bottom of 267, he writes, the infinite does not have being and potentiality in such a way that it will, at some time, have a being in actuality and be separable. There is no end in the sense of an achieved goal or completion to infinity, to infinite things. So what's an example of an infinite thing? Aristotle's example is a particular action, the act of dividing. So dividing a line, which you can continue to infinity. The action here is a mere procedure. It's endlessly repeated. The act can never be complete in numerical division. A complete action, by contrast, is one that can reach its goal. So that's how Aristotle segues from this analysis of infinity as something that doesn't contain actuality or potentiality to also include here a contribution to the theory or philosophy of action, which is that there's the distinction between complete and incomplete actions. Actions, you might say that by their very nature or essence, are aimed at and imply a kind of completion, like building. The action of building is complete when the product is completed. Then the construction company packs up and drives off. But dividing is a kind of action that can never be completed, can never reach its goal. So he's equating actuality here with this reaching the goal, this idea of reaching the goal. So whatever kind of being infinity has, it would seem like it's less than actuality because no goal is reached. Now, interestingly, later on, as we'll see, Aristotle associates eternal things with actually a higher degree of actuality than even concrete particular things. So infinity, as is being described here, seems to have some difference from eternity. We might note that. In Theta 7, Aristotle opens with the question, when is one thing potentially another thing? When is one thing potentially another thing? For example, when is Earth potentially a man? And his answer is to deny that it is, even though man ultimately comes from Earth. Rather, he says it's only when Earth has become a seed that it becomes potentially a man. only when Earth has become a seed. What this points to is that for Aristotle, it cannot be the case that it's correct to say everything and anything is potentially anything and everything. That's wrong. There has to be some kind of close continuity of some sort or other in order for one thing to potentially another. There has to be a regular causal process involved. So one thing that is potentially another does not become that other thing by chance. His example is that not just anything would be made healthy by medicine or by chance. This naturally raises the question, under what conditions then does a potential being come to be an actual being? And Aristotle's reply is that in the case of natural processes, the potential comes into being as long as there is no obstacle. As long as there is no obstacle. For example, the Earth doesn't become a human because there is an obstacle. The obstacle is that the Earth must first become a seed. In the case of artificial processes, there's an additional condition. An artificial process doesn't come about, again, as it doesn't come about if there is an obstacle, or it comes about only as long as there is no obstacle. But it also requires there to be a desire on the part of the maker. So in artificial processes, you have two conditions. A potential will be actualized as long as there's a desire on the part of the maker and there's no obstacle. Then the potentiality comes about. Next, Aristotle makes the point that there's a kind of series of potentialities which proceeds by steps. So, for example, Earth is potentially wood, and wood is potentially a box. But Earth is not potentially a box. However, because it belongs to a series that begins with Earth, it's clear that Earth is a condition of the actuality of the box. But Earth is not a potential box. It's not potentially a box. It's only by stages or by steps in a series that potentiality moves to actuality. That's what he wants to say. So Aristotle goes back and asks, is there something that is potentially Earth? And on 271, he says, if moreover there is something primary accounting for which is as XX-esque in terms of some other X is no longer available, then this item is primary matter. If, for instance, Earth is air-esque and Earth is not fire but fire-esque, then it is fire that is primary matter. And such matter is not a this something. This the way he translates it in terms of esque, but he means it's got this sort of quasi-quality that the Earth is sort of quasi-wood, to take an example, and the wood is a quasi-box. It's, as it were, pointing in the direction of the thing that it can potentially become. But at the beginning of such a series is going to be, he says, the primary matter. Prime matter is sort of the beginning of all such series. Prime matter potentially, it seems like he's going to say prime matter could potentially become anything within a certain series of steps, as we've described. Theta 8 concerns what we might describe as the chicken and the egg problem, which is this. If one thing can be the actualization of the potential in one thing, and at the same time the potentiality of another thing, as wood is the actualization of Earth and is itself a potential box, which is prior, the actual or the possible? So if a thing can be the actualization of potential in one thing, and at the same time the potentiality of another thing, as wood is the actualization of Earth and is itself a potential box, then which is prior, the actual or the possible? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? And Aristotle's answer is clearly that the actual is prior. The priority of actuality is a key Aristotelian doctrine. In what does the priority of the actual consist, though? And Aristotle's answer is that it's prior in two ways. It's prior in account and in substance. The actual is prior in account and it's prior in substance. How is it prior in account? On 272 through 273, he explains here, the last line here of 272, he says, the primary potential indeed just is what is potential by dint of admitting of actualization. Our account, for instance, of potential builder is possessing a potentiality to build. That of potential seer is possessing a potentiality to see, and that of potential visible is possessing a potentiality to be seen. The account generalizes across the other cases, from which it follows of necessity that the account of the actuality is prior to that of the potentiality, and that the knowledge of the former is prior to that of the latter. So how is it prior in account? The idea seems to be that the account of what a potentiality is a potentiality for depends on some prior knowledge of what something actually is and how it came to be that. So, for example, the knowledge of the potentiality of a caterpillar to become a butterfly depends upon someone acquiring knowledge of what actual butterflies are and how they developed. Likewise, there's always a temporal priority of species member over another member of the same species, provided it's not numerically the same species member. So, for example, a man in actuality for Aristotle always has priority over a man in potentiality, not because a man in actuality has temporal priority over, say, the seed from which he sprang, in Aristotle's biological understanding. However, it will be the case that there was an actual man who had temporal priority over this seed. And in addition, the actuality has substantial priority. So the first reason that Aristotle gives for this is that the things that are posterior in production have former and substantial priority. So he says on 274, the first reason that the actuality has substantial priority is things posterior in production have formal and substantial priority. A man has formal substantial priority over a boy, and a human being has formal substantial priority over a sperm. And the reason for this is that the man human being already has its form, whereas the boy sperm does not. This seems to rest on Aristotle's view that the substantial form is the true substance. The form of the boy, in this example, is man, the form man. And the form of the fully grown man is the same, man. But the potential man who is now boy, well, temporally prior to the actual man that he'll grow into, is not substantially prior, because the actual man possesses the form man in a more adequate way. That seems to be the way he's reasoning here in this paragraph that's giving what he calls the first reason. The second reason is that every output of production progresses towards a principle or towards an end. Every output of production progresses toward a principle or towards an end. Here the idea is that the end or goal towards which any output of production is progressing, the completion of the process, gives the marching orders, so to speak, to the process. The end or goal is what gives the marching orders to the process. It's what drives the process. And in that sense has a kind of ontological priority. So we might say that the actuality, which is the completion of the process, is, in this sense, the real substance of the whole process, because it's what's driving the whole process. On page 275, Aristotle also points to what he calls another profounder aspect to the substantial priority of actuality, which is that eternal things are purely actual. eternal things are purely actual. Eternal things are, for Aristotle, the most stable things of all in their being. For example, the Platonic forms, if there are any, or the numbers, the first mover. We'll get back to that idea in a future video. These are things that are fully actuality. And in contrast with actuality, there's kind of a wavering, shaky, or oscillating quality to potentiality. We might say every potentiality wavers, as it were, between one thing and its opposite, between P and not P. In Aristotle's example from the next chapter, chapter 9, he notes that anything that has the potentiality for being healthy as part of its account also has a potentiality for being ill. And other examples of this include being at rest, which also has a potentiality for being in motion. Being built, potentiality for being built is also a potentiality for being demolished. So that's the profounder reason, he says, that the purely actual things, the eternal things, the eternal things are purely actual things. They don't have any potentiality. And potentiality in comparison to the actual seems to have this wavering or oscillating quality of being because it can't decide. It can be one of two things. So this leads to the third discussion question. Is Aristotle right that actuality is prior in account and in substance to potentiality? Is Aristotle right that actuality is prior in account and in substance to potentiality? Can you think of any counter-arguments to his position? Does his position beg the question in any ways? Are there ontological features of potentiality that one might argue make it prior, in an ontological sense, to actuality in its account and or substance? So that's the third discussion question. Okay, Theta 9, which is the last chapter of Theta that includes actuality or concerns actuality and potentiality. So it's going to be the last one that we'll concern ourselves with here. And we can do this briefly. We just saw how every potentiality wavers, as it were, between one thing and its opposite, between P and not P. Anything that has a potentiality for being healthy in its account also has the potential for being ill. Anything that has the potentiality for being at rest also has the potentiality for being in motion. And anything that has the potentiality for being built also has the potentiality for being demolished. Now in Theta 9, Aristotle says, 1, it cannot be the case that two such opposites can simultaneously obtain. It cannot be the case that two such sets of opposites can simultaneously obtain. You see here an application of the principle of non-contradiction that Aristotle defended earlier in the Metaphysics. And second, it must be the case that with all such pairs, one is good and the other is evil. One is good and the other is evil. So being well and being ill, obvious example. One is good, being well. One is evil, being sick or unwell. Now Aristotle makes the interesting equation here of the good with the actual. The good with the actual. Now in this case, the evil thing is not paired with potentiality, but rather with privation or absence, lack. So goodness is actuality, whereas evil is just the privation of actuality. Evil doesn't really exist as a positive quality on this view. It's just a privation of the good. And there's an equation here of actuality with the good. Evil doesn't really exist. What do you think of that one?